Hi and welcome back to a new video. Thanks for joining me today. If you're new here, I'm Nat and I make mostly videos about books and random things in my life. but I'm guessing you're here because you want to know some books about climate change. And if you've been sticking around on my channel, you probably know that this is a constant theme in my life for the past year or so. Really thinking much more deeply about climate change and having that encounter through books, which is why I think it's so important for me to share these books with you today. I think climate change has always been a topic that I've been skirting around for the bulk of the past 5 years, but during the lockdown I had some time to be able to read, and that was when I picked up This Changes Everything by Naomi Klein, and I think that really made me realize I had to confront my inertia, my reluctance to admit that climate change was something that I had to deal with for the bulk of my life. I'm in my early 20s, so I'm still kind of young, and climate change is something that it's really a defining kind of struggle and issue for my generation. So that's something that I find still very difficult to grapple with, especially when talking to older generations. Oftentimes they'll say why are you so negative, why are you so pessimistic, and I mean the truth is things can look pretty gloomy when it comes to climate change. But anyway, that's a very tangential point. Let's get into the books. And I'm really happy to share these books with you today, and I think they're a whole range. I actually threw in one fiction book as well. I might do another video on Cli-Fi, which is climate fiction. I think that warrants an entirely different video. But this list will mostly be non-fiction. So the very first book I did mention just now is This Changes Everything by Naomi Klein. Naomi Klein is really the one of the very, very vocal and very obvious or apparent authors of climate change books. The subtitle of this book is Capitalism versus Climate Change versus Capitalism, and this was the first book that I read about climate change and how it tied climate change to all these issues, systemic problems, structural violences, and I already came from a kind of more social justice framework before this, so this was the book that made me realize that environmental justice is part and parcel of any sort of social justice that we want to achieve in this world. I think that Naomi Klein's writing is really to the point, very no BS, no bullshit in her writing. And I think all her other books as well have that kind of urgency. I guess I would say that if you don't know where to start, I would start with Naomi Klein's writing. It covers a lot of range, and she talks a lot about climate change in all her engagements, so she's really knowledgeable about the whole area. So I would definitely recommend starting with her books. So the second book that I want to recommend is really quite different from the first book in terms of how lighthearted it is. It is Climate Rebels by Ben Lerwill. It is a kind of illustration heavy book featuring stories of climate warriors, climate fighters all around the world. I really like the book because the illustrations the message is very, very hopeful and very optimistic, and the stories were about people all around the world. The illustrations were quite different page to page, so I think they definitely got different artists to work on this together. And overall, this was such an uplifting book, and I want to recommend this precisely. It might look like a children's book, and I think when I found the book, it was in the kind of young children's section. I think no, not young children, maybe mid children, preteen, so maybe for 12-year-olds. But I would recommend it to anyone to read, to pick up, because I think we definitely need a lot more of a light-hearted approach to difficult topics like these, and to showcase the stories of climate warriors all over the world, because it's often the case that a lot of climate discourse or debates is very heavily centered on a few countries, without recognizing that actually this is a global issue, and their efforts by a lot of people all around the world that we might not, hear of in mainstream media, but these are stories that help to encourage us, no matter where we are, to do our very best, and that you don't have to be a very huge person with lots of influence to make a difference in wherever you are. So I think this book really helped me give a little bit. It gave me a lot of hope. I guess it gave me a lot more optimism. That's why I want to recommend it. I think it's a good break from the heavier doom and gloom books if you ever want to take a break but still think about or still want to read about climate change. The next book I want to recommend is Under a White Sky, The Nature of the Future by Elizabeth Kolbert. Now, Kolbert is another author that writes a lot about climate change, and I think that she writes more of the environmental perspective. So while Naomi Klein definitely writes from more journalistic and more of like a overarching political, social perspective, I think Kolbert writes from a lot more of a science and research perspective, and I think that's really, really exciting and interesting to read. I did read The Sixth Extinction by Kolbert as well in my few months of reading heavily about climate change, and I really, really liked her perspective. I think Kolbert really makes the science more accessible and really grounds observations in her own research, and definitely gives us as readers access to all these, all these pinpoints, like specific locations that, where change is felt and where change is being kind of confronted, head on. While Sixth Extinction was talking about the mass extinction of a lot of species today, The Nature of the Future talks about how people have been responding to the climate crisis with various levels of scientific intervention. And I think that's really interesting. I think I haven't really fully finished the book, but it is full of details. It is full of questions of what is nature, what is humans' role in engineering nature, is it possible to help avert the climate crisis through more control, and how we shouldn't have to think of ourselves as separate from nature, that rather we also have an equal hand in creating the environment that we want for the world and all its inhabitants. I would say that in the same vein of learning about the environment, I also want to recommend Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. Now, this is such an exceptional book. I heard it I read it as an audiobook as well. The author narrated the book, and it's just so fantastic. Kind of feels like a very cozy nighttime story. The author herself is also a scientist, ethnobotanist, and does a lot of research into indigenous knowledge about the environment, and that's really amazing. I think there is such a respect for the environment that I sense from the writing of the indigenous practices. And I think overall it's a story of not just indigenous knowledge, but how we need to respect our land, and how we can learn these very, very long-standing traditions, how those traditions stem from values of like abundance and from mutual respect, and that it is not extractive, it is more of a restorative and healing relationship with the environment. And I think it's overall such an amazing read. There's just so much information and knowledge, but also a lot of tenderness and vulnerability that the author reveals about her experience. I think when we think about climate change, we must read about the environment, and I think a lot of what makes our relationship to the land, that's a question that comes up a lot in the climate change books that I've been reading, because I think for myself I haven't really grappled with that, having been raised in a city landscape. I haven't really had the opportunity to form deeper bonds with nature, or to really interrogate my own ties with the land, you know, my own ancestry and things like that. These are topics that really haven't really come to mind. I think that's the whole point of, I think that's the kind of desired outcome of, you know, urbanization and capitalism and colonization, is that you kind of cut off ties to the land, and that has really dire consequences, you know, such as like being unable to respect the land or being unable to form a healthy kind of reciprocal relationship with the land. So that's Braiding Sweetgrass, really highly recommended. I also want to recommend this book called The Future We Choose, Surviving the Climate Crisis by Christiana, Figueres and Tom Rivett-Carnac. I don't know whether I pronounced that right, but this is a pretty straightforward book. It's just basically these two authors who have been quite involved in the policy side of climate change efforts, how they outline two possible scenarios, one in which we do everything we can to stop climate change, and the other in which we just don't do anything at all at the present moment. And it's pretty riveting. It's pretty like shocking, because I listened to it as an audiobook as well, and I think it's really quite frightening to think about the future, how, you know, if you don't really put in the effort now, things might turn out really bad. But I don't want to make it too pessimistic, because the book is generally an optimistic one. It is kind of like a very practical how-to book, exactly what we should do right now. And when I was listening to this book, I think one thing that really popped up was our ability to imagine, was our ability to sort of like work towards a future that we can, you know, envision, and how we have to work towards that. I think a lot of the problems nowadays is that everything's so doom and gloom, and to the point where we can't really imagine how the future will look like. So this book was super helpful in like really giving me exact scenarios, like if this happens, this might happen, instead of like I don't want to think about it at all. So really straightforward book, policy level, very much more of action focused rather than like an internal reflection or like internal kind of upending. Is a lot more of like a external what to do after you've kind of come to terms with the fact that something has to be done. So that's that book. And moving on, I want to recommend two books that's about eco-anxiety, and that is A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety, How to Keep Your Cool on a Warming Planet by Sarah Jaquette Ray. I think I have the book as a library book right now. And the second book is A Guide to Eco-Anxiety by Grose. I read The Guide to Eco-Anxiety first last year, and I'm currently reading this one. And I would say that they both talk about eco-anxiety, and I think there's many different terms now. There's climate anxiety, there's eco-anxiety, there's like climate grief, and there's this term that I can't pronounce that's about like, you know, a grief for the land that is, you know, destined to be taken down or destined to be removed. And there's just so many terms right now, and all these terms are popping up because of our need to understand and to grapple with like specific negative moods that are directly a result of climate change or a result of environmental environmental destruction. And so the difference between the two books is that I think the Anouchka Grose book is a lot more casual. It's a lot more of a very like lifestyle kind of book. It's very friendly, it's very optimistic, it's very like more for your everyday kind of thing. Whereas like I think this book touches more on the background or the context of climate anxiety and how that how that came about. And this author is actually a professor who teaches environmental studies, a high school teacher, sorry, not professor. And so this teacher sees firsthand the kind of cycles that, you know, the students go through. And so it becomes very like it becomes something that's very much informed from like a very informed perspective, which I appreciate quite a lot. So I would say that I would recommend this book more for younger people, because this kind of keeps younger people in mind as the audience. So it's for Gen Z, or the climate generation, whereas the Guide to Eco-Anxiety book is a lot more general. It's very, very much like tips to make you feel happy, tips to make you feel less bad about yourself. It's very, like the other book is a lot more like flip friendly, but this is a lot more introspective and more of an explanation book. So I think choose what you may. They both talk about climate anxiety, and they both give very helpful tips on how to manage them. I think this is a lot more of a reflective and upending kind of like upheaval book. The other is a lot more soothing and kind of like talking to your good friend about the issues. So pick the books according to how you might need them, but I definitely think that reading books about climate anxiety is super important, because after you read all these climate change books, most likely you'll be feeling really, really like stuck and you're not sure what to do, and the psychological impacts are really, really, really important. Like you can't gloss over it when you want to do something about climate change. So please do pick up a book on climate anxiety or eco grief, or anything in that area, because really, like, we're going to be grappling with this for the next few decades. So we better be psychologically prepared for that, you know. Okay, this video is getting really long, but the last two books I want to recommend are pretty contextual. So the second last book is Eating Chili Crab in the Anthropocene by Matthew Schneider-Mayerson. It's a collection of essays about climate change issues and environmental issues here in Singapore, written by, you know, a whole range of undergraduate students as part of a class that they were doing on like environmental studies in Singapore. So I would say that I'm recommending this, especially if you're a Singaporean watching this video. I recommend this because it is, I think, the only book that's about climate change in Singapore, like specifically in Singapore, and it's quite accessible to read. So I would say it's kind of like a primer to, you know, ongoing issues in Singapore, and for that reason I would recommend it quite highly to anyone who's interested in the way Singaporean issues kind of intersect with environmental issues, and also at large. There's also questions about relationships between Singapore and the region, as well as Singapore's kind of like political stance on climate change, which often doesn't really get interrogated as much. I will also leave some links down below to Instagram handles that talk about environmental issues in Singapore. So if you want more information, I think it'll be best to check those handles out. But if you're interested in reading a book about it, you can definitely read this book. The last book I want to recommend is a Cli-Fi. It's called The Ministry for the Future by Stanley Robinson. And let me tell you, this is a wonderful introduction to Cli-Fi, which is why I said that I would do another video separately on Cli-Fi. This is the book that kind of convinced me that I should be reading more fiction as a way to practice my imagination, and a way to grapple with, you know, many different possible outcomes, which is something that nonfiction can't really do, which is to give you characters and give you situations that are relatable, and that you can see yourself in. So this book is pretty thick, and I want to read Robinson's other books because of this. But I think everything that I recommended earlier, like all the nonfiction books, it's so cool to see how that overlaps with this Cli-Fi book, and how there's so many issues that these authors talked about in the nonfiction books that, you know, Robinson was able to articulate in very possible scenarios in the future. I mean, it's speculative fiction, and it made me really reflect a lot more deeply on the issues that were raised in all these books that I've read about climate change. And I think that's why it's so important to pair whatever you read non-fiction wise on climate change to all these books that authors are putting out about, you know, how our futures might look like. Because I think you can't really enact change if you don't have that capacity to imagine, like better futures, or like alternatives where you have, you still maintain some kind of some level of control over your environment, over your circumstances. I mean, that is all for this video. I was not expecting to film a video about climate change books, but because lately I've been trying to put together a blog post for a website here in Singapore, so I've been jumping back into these books as a way to recommend them. So do check these books out. Do let me know if there are other books that you want to recommend to me about climate change, and it'll be cool to read more about climate change from perspectives that are outside of the US. Unfortunately, most of these books are written very much from a US context, and I think some authors recognize this, some authors don't. Some authors just naturally their scope is really limited to the US. So I don't know whether I'm missing out on really amazing climate change books that are not from that perspective, but I would love to know more about those books than if I'm missing out on them. So anyway, thanks so much for watching till the very end. If you did, do comment down below, I guess, like an emoji of the weather that you like the most. So if you like rain, you can put a little rain cloud. If you like a sunny warm weather, you can put a sun. If you like snow, you can put a snowflake. Just comment down below your favorite weather emoji. And yeah, so thanks for joining me, and I wish you all an amazing week ahead. I hope you know that you're not alone in grappling with climate change issues. It is a very difficult topic, but I hope these books help you in that journey as they helped me in that journey. And I'll see you in the next video. Until then, do take care, and I wish y'all a very good rest tonight after a long day of work. So let's go. Thanks, and see you.